time. Apologize if you would be hearing this for the first time, but the question and answer time that we were supposed to have after the service today has been postponed. As many of you know, Pastor Andrew is out today, and he had worked so diligently to put this together, to get the live stream going. We were hoping to have all of this piped home to those who couldn't be here as well, but we're not quite sure if we'll end up sending those answers to those questions out virtually in maybe written form, or if we'll just postpone it. But just appreciative of Pastor Andrew for putting together this idea of even having some question and answer times where we as a congregation can take the application of the gospel and look at it into some very specific current situations in which we're facing today. And so we love the idea. Just the timing of it didn't work out today, but thank you for being kind of patient with us as we roll along and find in these uncertain times our way through this. And, you know, just I guess this way of reminder for all of us, in uncertain times, there's an unsettling that can happen in our hearts, an unsettling of even wondering, is anything stable? Do we have control of anything? And in those times of just feeling completely out of control or out of settledness, we just trust and rest our hearts in the settled one. As Jeremy was mentioning as he opened the service today, Christ on the throne. He's never dethroned. He's never unthroned. He's never out of control. We serve a sovereign God who has things that work according to the perfect purpose of His will. And so in unsettledness and in uncertainty, we trust, we hope, we rest in the certain settled one. So let that just soak in this morning. I know I was burdened in prayer this morning coming today, realizing that maybe there would just be some who come today and need to hear a word of hope, need to hear a word of encouragement, need to hear a word of confidence and joy as we cast our eyes on the Lord, who is the certain one. That is where we find our stability, brothers and sisters. That is where we find our rest and our true hope. If we hope in anything in this world, it cannot hold us, cannot hold up. I think years ago I had a little music stand. I don't see one here today, so I can't use it. But I said if we tried to put our weight onto one of those music stands and wanted that to uphold who we were, to throw and cast ourselves on it, it would collapse. It is not intended, is not designed to bear the weight of who we are. Nothing in this world is designed and intended to bear the weight of your full hope and trust. That is designed and intended for God alone. And so that is where we put our trust and our hope in Him. He can bear that weight. He will bear that weight as we trust in Him. Well, we turn our attention to the Scriptures today. I want to start off by just introducing us to a man. Maybe many of you are familiar with William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce fought nearly his entire life to bring an end to the slave trade in England. And before all of that, though, when he was about at the age of 25, he was having a bit of life direction crisis. As a young man growing up, he was always interested in politics, and he was very successful at politics. At the age of 21, he ran for Parliament in England, and he won. So he was seated there at the age of 21. But at the age of 25, he began to ask some deeper questions about his life direction, what should I be doing? He actually said that he was maybe feeling a call to go into ministry, to become a pastor and be full-time ministry. One of his great influential figures was a man by the name of John Newton. You would know him through his famous song, Amazing Grace. So John Newton was a pastor, had written a number of songs as he was a pastor, and he was a large influence on William Wilberforce. And so William Wilberforce begins at about the age of 25 to wonder, is ministry my calling? Is this what I'm going to be doing? He was questioning where he was in life and if God had something greater or bigger or different for him. So he meets with some of his mentors. He actually meets with John Newton, and Newton kind of sized up his life a little bit and gave him some advice. He said, you know, William, why don't you just continue in politics and do as much Christian good as you can where God has placed you? He said, I'm not saying that the Lord isn't calling you into the pastorate, but why don't, at least in the meantime, stay where you are and do as much Christian good as you can in the place that God has put you. That is exactly what William Wilberforce did. He took up the cause of the slave trade, and he fought that for 46 years of his life. I'll give us the conclusion to his story at the end of the message today. But I wonder if today Wilberforce's life experience might be similar to many, if not most, of our own. Once becoming a Christian, we began to wrestle with these very important questions. What am I to be, and what am I to do? You ever thought about or wrestled with those two very important questions? Okay, God has done a work in my life. What am I now to be, and what am I to do? The wonder of the Sermon on the Mount, which is where we've been for a number of weeks now. Jesus, in the opening portions of the Sermon on the Mount, he answers those two very large questions. What are we to be? And then today we'll look at, as he shifts gears a bit, into what are we to do? So we've been looking at these 8 verses called the Beatitudes, where when we belong to God, when God draws us unto himself and he does a salvation work in our hearts, he begins to do something inside of us. He then is begun to describe, through Jesus' words here in Matthew chapter 5, to describe what those who belong to God are to be. We are to be, and we have the blessing of God conferred upon us for those who are poor in spirit, for those who mourn, for those who are meek, for those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for those who are merciful, for those who are pure in heart, for those who are peacemakers, for those who are persecuted. These are largely interior or internal things that God is doing in our hearts so that we become, so that we be. When God does a work in our hearts, you know, those of you who are Christians, who are believers, who have been redeemed, who have been transformed, God begins to do a churning work in your heart where these things, though you never possessed them before, though you never desired them before, they now become desires and delights of your heart as you offer your life to worship to God. So that question, what are we to be? The Beatitudes actually answer that question for us. There's 8 verses there laying out, not in exhaustive form, but certainly in a total fashion. This is what the person belonging to God, this is what a Christ follower is to be. Now, beginning today in verse 13, Jesus is going to shift gears away from the Beatitudes. Those are now closed, and he begins to describe for us what Christ followers, what those belonging to God are now to do. What they are now to do. How do those Beatitudes begin to work their way out into my life? It's a beautiful symmetry that Jesus is putting together in this Sermon on the Mount. Here is the calling of the heart. Here is what the person belonging to God is to be. And now, how do those things that are working inside of us begin to push and work themselves out into our everyday life? So beginning in verse 13, Jesus begins to tell us what our lives should be about, what our purpose on earth is. How are we to impact the world? It's really a good question for us to ask at any age and at any stage of life. As I mentioned, William Wilberforce, about 25 years old, he's looking ahead to his future and wondering, what am I to do? And whether it be in the teenage years where we might be asking that question, the middle of life years where we might be asking that question, the older life years where we're still asking that same question, what am I to do? Jesus is going to cover all of that spectrum today in just this one verse. What is the purpose of my life? Whether I'm a farmer, a teacher, a businessman, a homemaker, a student, a pastor, all of those things, what are we to be about? What is the focus of my life to do? With God working in me, what is he desiring to do through me? So we turn our attention today to Matthew 5:13. I've titled this morning's message, How Christians Impact the World. How are we as Christians to impact the world? Do we just sit on our hands until God gives us some large calling somewhere in a foreign land far away to people we've never met? Maybe that is the thought sometimes. It's like, well, I'm waiting for the Lord to do something, to give me something big and specific. Or is Scripture clear on this? Maybe it has a little bit more day-to-day impact than we realize. And so we're going to look today from Matthew 5:13. How are Christians instructed with these Beatitudes living in us? How are they to come out of us? How are we then to impact the world? What is God doing through us for the world? Jesus is going to use two very powerful and penetrating metaphors, beginning in verse 13, and then also next week when we look at verse 14. He's going to use these two metaphors of salt and light. And maybe initially we don't understand how penetrating and powerful these are, but these will describe for us the Christian's purpose in the world and what effect that has, what impact that has on the people around us. Today, we're going to look at this first one, that Christians are to be salt. And even though we'll have 3 points to this message today, there's two basic ideas that come from this idea of being salt, and it is to preserve and to flavor. It is to preserve those around us from decay, and it is to flavor those around us, to bring out the best that God has for them. So if you go away today with just these two words in mind, we will take away the impact of what Jesus is saying to us, that when he says, you are salt, it means, Christian, that you were put on this earth and God has redeemed you to do a work through you that is both preserving, hindering the decay of society and people around you, and it is to flavor those as well, to bring out the best that God has for others in their lives, to preserve and to flavor. Let's look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. We'll look at this metaphor and then just slow down and take it in and see what the Lord has to teach us today. Matthew 5:13 says this, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. The first thing that we can say about this verse and what Jesus is teaching here is that we are to embrace our difference from the unbelieving world. When Jesus says you are the salt, he refers to those belonging to God as this metaphor of salt. And he's making some very direct statements about salt, but he's also making an implied statement about society. Why would society need to be salted anyway? So to make a direct statement that Christians are salt, it's making an indirect statement that society has some kind of tendency in it, something bred in it, something within it that needs to be salted. That society has a tendency to putrefy, a tendency to decay. And Christians are put there with God working through them to hold back the decay of society. The implication is that society needs salt. It is in a declining state. It is in a state of decay. I don't mean to get too graphic and gross here, but society and humanity is like an animal carcass. It's progressively growing worse and worse. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to look around and to see that society in the whole never trends towards the better. It never trends towards the moral. It never trends towards improvement. It trends towards the decay, towards the immoral, towards drifting further and further away from God. And so what this verse is teaching, what Jesus is saying is sending his followers out into the world to be salt because the world needs to be salted. It tends toward decay, and so as peppered throughout the world, it is holding some of that decay at bay. We understand the animal carcass analogy, don't we? If you've ever been out on a walk, my wife and I like to go walking sometimes out at the parklands or just even up and down the street here in front of the church. If you've ever been out for a walk before, and before you ever see anything, you get this real pungent smell, and you're like, ooh, something is rotting. Maybe you go another 5 or 10 feet and you see off to the side of the road this bloated carcass that's sitting there, and it's in some stage of decay. We understand what that means to have a dead thing decaying. Jesus is being very frank with his disciples here and being very clear about the state of the world and the state of society apart from God. It is in a stage of decay. And so the salt of followers of Christ is there to put that at bay, to keep it withheld. You see, mankind likes to paint the picture of ourselves as good people. This is what you might just hear on the whole from the world's point of view, that we are good people, or we're at least neutral. And there's this great hope of making great moral progress. But we can see and we continue to observe that on the whole, the world is sliding hopelessly away from that. Just for an example, there was a lot of hope. You can go back and read history and the accounts of these things at the turn of the 20th century. There was a lot of hope. People looked upon the world with a lot of optimism because of the intelligence that was happening, because of the revolution of all of the technological advances. They thought the 20th century, was going to be the greatest century in the history of the world. We've got smarts, we've got medicine, we've got science, we've got education. It's going to be wonderful. It was to be the golden era of advancement on all fronts. Mankind was evolving in tremendous ways, said the world. And so wars would stop, diseases would be cured, suffering and all forms of prejudice and injustice and inequality would end because man is morally good and we are on the right track and we are going up. That was the optimism heading into the 20th century. Well, those 100 years came and went. Mankind showed once again that through all of the world wars and all of the other things, completely the opposite of the optimism that they were showing, once again proved that we trend towards not good and healing and improvements, but we trend towards further decay, that we trend towards decline. This is always the case. This has always been the case. Humans left to their own devices always progress further and further away from God. And all we need to do is just observe the moral fabric of our society. You turn on a television today, you'll see things far more offensive than you did 20 years ago. And if you would have turned the television on 20 years ago, you would have seen things far more offensive than you would the previous 20 years before that. And on it goes. And so we slide towards decay. And so Jesus just making this statement here, after these Beatitudes, God is going to work inside of you. He is changing you from the inside out. Now, what does that mean for you as you are sent out into the world? It means that you are salt. You are going into a place that needs salt to hinder the decay. And so this is what Jesus is telling us. And I make this point because, brothers and sisters, as Christians, we need to know that, realize that, and embrace that. I remember maybe as a teenager or certainly early on in my Christian faith, I don't know that I fully embraced the fact that God is wanting to do something through us and that we would be far different and have a stark difference in the world. Maybe even sometimes as Christians we want to slide in more towards aligning with the world or looking closer like the world. Jesus is going to say you are going to stand out. In other words, embrace and glory in your difference. God has put you here and redeemed you for a purpose that you be salt. And salt is going to look different, and salt is going to stand out. So embrace this and glory in it. Glory in the fact that God would be working through you to hold back the decay of society. That's a tremendous calling. And so in this context and in this situation, Jesus is telling his followers, you are different. When God does a work in your heart, you are different. Embrace this difference. Glory in this difference. Glory in this calling that God has given to you, that he has put within your heart something different. You have a purpose this purpose is to be salt. Let's look at this verse again, because it's going to lead us now into our second point, and here's where we get into these qualities of salt. He just simply says this very potent statement, you are the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth. The second point we can draw from this text is this: how do Christians impact the world around them? As salt, we boldly stand to preserve the world from evil decay. As salt, this metaphor that Jesus is using, we boldly stand to preserve the world from evil decay. Now, before we get into the preservation idea of what salt actually does, let me make a couple of observations here. First, you see that Jesus says, you are. He had changed kind of the tone just a couple of verses before, talking generally to talking very specific and making it very personal. And here we go again. Jesus is zoning in to say, you are this. This is not something that you must go out and seek to obtain. You don't have to be a high-level Christian who's been knowing the Lord for 30 years before this is the case. No, if you are redeemed by God through Christ, if you have been saved, your soul has been redeemed by God, you are salt. God's transforming work in you fashions you into this person. He fills his divine salt shaker, if you will, with redeemed souls, and he shakes them out into society. We are, in a sense, have been scattered out of God's divine salt shaker. If he has redeemed us, we are his salt. The second thing we can see here is this: Jesus uses the word world. You are the salt of the earth. He's using this word for the entire world, the entire earth. Isn't this amazing? We consider this context where Jesus is teaching this famous Sermon on the Mount. It's in a remote northern part of Israel. In fact, they're on the northwestern side of the Sea of Galilee. They're on the shorelines there of this little city called Capernaum. It's a fishing town. Their main produce is to catch fish out of the Sea of Galilee and to export them and to eat them. These are fishermen. On the whole, these are people in a very small geographical area. Jesus is preaching, even though many had gathered from other places. We said the crowd was quite large. They had come from around. But just think of this context for a moment. Jesus is telling these people, you are the salt of the entire world. You are the salt of the entire earth. He didn't say, you're the salt of little Capernaum here. He didn't say, oh, you're the salt of the region of Galilee. That's pretty important. No, he said, you, as Christ followers, you will impact the entire world because you are salt. And maybe sometimes we think that we might have some insignificance in life because of our geographical locked-in location or whatever it might be. Our circle of influence doesn't quite have the concentric circles that others do. Jesus is telling these fishermen, these farmers, these travelers right here in Capernaum, you are the salt of the earth. So even from a small lakeside fishing town, they could impact the entire world. Jesus could say the very same thing today. You, Lexington, you, Chenoa, you, Fairbury, you, Towanda, you that are here hearing this word, you are the salt of the entire earth. Your Christianity can be sprayed and peppered and speckled throughout the earth to have tremendous impact for God because it is him working in you, desiring to work through you. You are salt. Well, now let's look at what this metaphor means. What does this metaphor of salt really mean? What is the importance of salt? Salt has essentially been used for two major purposes down throughout history. It certainly would have been used for these two purposes back in Jesus' day. The first is to preserve, and the second is to flavor. So let's look at this first one. Salt preserves. It is first a preservative. It preserves by slowing down the process of decay. So in days before refrigeration, this was a very important mineral. This was a very important option to have salt so that you could preserve your food. In fact, as I mentioned, Capernaum was a fishing town. By salting fish and rubbing salt on the fish and doing it in such a way, the fish could be preserved for up to a year. And think about that in days before refrigeration. To be able to take some meat and to preserve it for up to a year, that was very valuable. To put salt on the meat or to put salt in a preservative way draws out the water so that it inhibits the microorganisms from growing. Very valuable, very helpful process to preserve. As salt, we're taking that metaphor now, applying it to Christians. As salt, Christians preserve society by slowing down the process of evil and moral decay. We do this by upholding Christian living. We do this by upholding godly living. We do this by walking out our Christian life, by living in such a way that we are walking worthy of our calling. I think of the example of Abraham Lincoln, when as a youngster he had this job and he was asked by a boss, a superior of his, to do something that was not quite moral. He actually asked him to rip off one of the customers and to do something mischievous and deceiving. And Abraham Lincoln, even at a young age, looked to his boss and he said, I can't do that. His boss was really putting some pressure on him. And he finally said to his boss, look, I'm not going to steal for you. But what this means is that I will never steal from you. And so even in those moments where he was being leaned on by society to compromise his integrity, he stood up as salt and he said, look, I'm not going to do that for you, but I won't do that to you either. He was suppressing the decay that was looking to spread even in his work context. Our words and our actions form a sort of societal conscience that preserves and slows moral decay. We do this by valuing the things that God values. We do this by valuing the family unit, which, as we know, in our American society is beginning to decline and decay almost by the day. We do this by valuing love and charity and worship. We do this by valuing the sanctity of life, and may our voices never be quieted on that matter. We do this by holding up what God holds up, and in doing this, we become a voice for the Lord in our society and in this world, and we suppress or at least hold down for a time the decay that is looking to creep up and to grow. And so the preservative nature of salt, very important here, that Christians, those following Christ, those who have been called of God, that we stand up and be counted as those who uphold these things, and by doing that, we hold back, we suppress the decay of society. Very specifically, let me ask it this way. Because you are a Christian, do people around you ever feel hindered in their doing of wrong? Do people around you feel hindered in their doing of wrong because you're a Christian? I know that some of this stuff might seem simple and a bit mundane, but do people, if they use language, I get this all the time when people find out I'm a pastor, a word flies out of their mouth, oh, I'm sorry, pastor. And I just kind of say, it's not me you have to worry about. No, I don't always do that. But do people have a consciousness in them that they would do something if you weren't there, or they would say something, or they feel apologetic about it because you're there, if you weren't there? There is something very salty that should be about our life. Not that we walk around as judgmental goody two-shoes, but that we carry our Christianity with integrity. That people know. And that it does in some fashion, in some way, shape, or form, at times small and at times larger, but it holds at bay the things that would normally be said or done in our presence. Brothers and sisters, that's God using you as salt. He's using your life to preserve and put at bay the things that would normally run rampant or a Christian influence not present and there? So as a Christian, because you're a Christian, do people ever feel hindered to do wrong around me? Do they feel frustrated by their limitations? Do they apologize at times? Bear this sword, bear this cross gladly. This is the Lord using you as salt. Secondly, we've looked at it being a preservative, but also it has this idea of flavoring. And so, this is our third point here. As salt, secondly, was to boldly stand to preserve the world from evil decay. Thirdly, we take from this text here, as salt, we are to actively live to flavor the world with godly joy and purpose. We actively live to flavor the world around us with godly joy and purpose. The second major purpose of salt is to flavor. Imagine you're walking through your kitchen. There's a freshly popped bowl of popcorn right there on the counter. You grab a handful of it, you throw a few kernels into your mouth, and you're like, it's good. A little bland. I could eat a little bit more, but then I'd be good. But then you take some nice melted butter, pour it on that popcorn, you get out the salt shaker and you throw some salt, and then you throw a little bit more, and then go a little bit more, shake it up. Now you grab a handful. I'm getting some amens finally with the salt. No, you grab a handful, you begin to eat it, and you're like, oh, I can't stop now. I need some more of that. And before you know it, the bowl is gone. The salt has brought out the flavor. It's done its work. It is seasoned. It is done its work for you on the food. It has taken something that might normally be a bit bland. It has now brought out its flavoring and its seasoning. The salt flavors. It brings out the best taste of food. It brings out the best taste of things that otherwise might be neutral or tasteless or bland. And now we take that metaphor and we bring it into the Christian walk and the Christian life. As salt, Christians flavor those around them to bring out others' joy and purpose in God. Their life begins to season and flavor other people so that the joy that God has given to us, the joy of worship, the joy of faith, the joy of having sins forgiven, the joy of eternity in heaven, the joy of fellowship, the joy of church, the joy of being able to walk through this life not empty, not alone, because God is with us. We begin to use our lives, the God and the work that He has done in us, to flavor others around us. So let me just ask this question very specifically to you. Are people, because you are a Christian, are people, when they are around you, their best version of what God wants them to be? Do I encourage them to keep going, to live for the Lord, to walk and not grow weary, knowing that they will reap if they faint not? Does my life, does your life flavor others as salt would flavor what would normally be bland and neutral? Do we flavor others around us to keep going for the Lord? Yes, press on. Yes, push for the greater. Yes, 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 say yes to the Lord every time. You'll never regret it. Is this what we do? When others leave our presence, are they uplifted? Do they go away refreshed? Are we flavoring because we are salt of God working in us? Do we flavor others around us? We come to the close of this verse. And it was just the first statement that Jesus makes there, packed with an idea. This metaphor is so rich and powerful. You are the salt of the earth. Brothers and sisters, let that just hammer into our minds as we go from here today. God has done a work in us so that we are representatives of Him as salt on this earth. We are that. We are that. Then it comes and closes here with the warning, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. We know scientifically that salt cannot lose its salt property. It is a stable compound. It cannot become undone. What Jesus is saying here, though, is not that a grain of salt would lose its salt character. But what he is saying here is that salt can become contaminated and mixed with impurities. Salt can be mixed with its surroundings to the point where it becomes ineffective. Salt can be blended together with other things, and it no longer has the salty properties that it should have as pure salt. When this happens, salt loses its purpose and becomes diminished and useless. This is what happens when salt no longer can be used for salt purposes. It is nothing but to be thrown out and to be trodden under feet. It becomes asphalt for people walking on top of. Our warning and challenge from Jesus here is to keep our eyes on the Savior, not on the world, and to remain unmixed, uncontaminated, unpolluted from the world and by the influences of the world, so that we remain the pure salt of God. We live out our calling and our purpose as salt. So this is a tall tale for us. This is a tall calling. We can do it with the sure help and strength of God, but we are to remain unmixed, remain divided away from the influences of the world so that we can actually remain as salt to the world. We go blending in and have no distinguishable characteristics from the world. We've lost our saltiness. We've lost our distinction as salt. And so we stand boldly in the integrity that God has given to us, the work that He's done in our heart to say we'll remain pure salt, to stand tall so that we might affect the world around us as salt. Let me finish quickly this story of William Wilberforce. At the age of 25, he goes to John Newton and he says, maybe the Lord's calling me into something else. Maybe He's calling me to be a pastor or be in a ministry. And as I mentioned, John Newton told him, why don't you stay in politics and just be salt wherever God has placed you? At the age of 27, just a couple of years later, as Wilberforce is still working out maybe his life plan, praying about, seeking counsel of what he should do, at the age of 27, he sits down and he writes 2 goals for his life. He said, Lord, if you are willing, this is what I would desire to do. If you've given me this vision, make it come to be. But he sat down and he wrote 2 main objectives that he wanted to accomplish in his life. The first one is this. He wanted to suppress the slave trade. He wanted to suppress the slave trade that was going on, and he wanted to use his political influences to do it. That is preserving salt. He wanted to suppress the slave trade. The second thing that he wanted to do, the second main objective, he wanted to reform the morality of his society around him. He looked around and he said, on the whole, British Christianity is bland. He even wrote this little pamphlet asking them if they were just professors of Jesus Christ or possessors of Jesus Christ. He said, I want to know, is this just something you talk about, or is this just something that you do, something that you live out? And so he wanted to reform the morality of society. This is flavoring salt. His 2 main objectives at the age of 27, he wanted to be preserving salt, to suppress the decay that was going on, and he wanted to be flavoring salt to bring out those around him that they would live their true joy and purpose in God. After 46 years of his life in politics, after 46 years of serving in the parliament, 3 days before he died, after fight of decades-long fighting, 3 days before he died, finally it was signed into law that the slave trade in England would be no more. God fulfilled the burden, the vision that He gave to William Wilberforce to be salt in his day in the context in which he lived, in the context in which God put him. Christian, brother, sister in Christ, you are salt. You are called to preserve, and you are called to flavor. You don't need a missionary calling. You don't need a vocational ministry calling. Maybe the Lord would give that to you. Maybe that is what He has planned for your life. But in the meantime, don't wait for something like that to make an impact in the world. Impact your world, the context where God has placed you and where you are. Impact it for Jesus Christ. In the workplace, be salt, preserve and flavor. In your neighborhood, be salt, preserve and flavor. In the church, preserve and flavor. In your home, preserve and flavor. I know sometimes, especially in times of quarantine, where maybe activity of life has somewhat been drawn back, and we may be spending more time within the four walls of our house and with family, we might be thinking, oh, when is God going to call me to get out there and do something big, to do something grand? You have a big and grand calling. It is to be salt in every context to which God has placed you. We are to preserve and we are to flavor. Fulfill your purpose and calling. You are the salt of God. His beatitudes living in you create salt-like living out of you. Let us hear the words of Jesus today. You are the salt of the earth because of what God has done in your heart and your life. Let's close our time in prayer this morning. Father, would you guard us from shying away from the clear and powerful calling of this verse? Lord, there are times where we might feel like we have insignificant jobs and tasks and duties in your kingdom. But just as the thousands of faces that Jesus would have spoken this very word to years ago, on a hillside in Capernaum, obscure fishing village, that they would spread out and scatter throughout the entire earth. Lord, might that calling be renewed on us today, that in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our workplace, and in our schools, and in the church, that we would hear this purpose and calling put on our life, that we would be salt, preserving against the